But my question is, if we look at the period of the G7 when it was the G8, and it included Russia, which I think was like late 90s, 1997, until the acquisition of Crimea in 2014. So it was a pretty long-ish period. You said that the idea behind that was to incorporate Russia into sort of the Western order. Well, I guess these days it's called the rules-based order. We don't really know what it means, but that's the term that that gets thrown around. But you kind of said that they were trying to model Russia and have it become this sort of a Western-style economy. In my opinion, it was more about purely having access to Russian resources without really caring about the internal dynamics. I mean, as long as the political system in Russia was not intervening and interfering with having as much access as possible and having beneficial, essentially, circumstances for these Western companies coming in. I don't think they ever had any interest in transforming Russia into anything close and bringing it up, let's say, economically to the Western European powers. But, that's my opinion. What do you think?
Well, it's pretty much possible because, as we all know, Russia has huge resources, especially that are especially useful for energy sector. As a matter of fact, we are talking about oil and mostly, of course, gas, land, as much as you'd like. And other resources, of course, it's basically one of the major world sources of fertilizers, and there's a lot of other aspects that Russia could contribute to the economies of the G7. Though, of course, I don't think that they were interested in the good of the Russians. But they seem to be interested in at least keeping things in Russia as they were in the 90s, in a kind of chaotic liberal democracy. That's why, for example, since then, and since a bit before, as a matter of fact, George Soros began working in Russia even, and try to open there a division of the open society. So in the sense that they were trying to keep things as it were in the 90s, I think they were, but in the sense that, for example, they would wish to turn Russia into a normal, stable republic, or something like that. I agree with you. They were much more interested in Russian resources than anything else. So it's both at the same time. When I said that they wanted to integrate Russia into the Western world, it's a kind of integration where, of course, Russia would be a second-class country, not as the Russian elites thought Russia would be treated, and but at the same time where the hegemonic values would be the values of neoliberalism, of consumerism, Western style aesthetics, culture, pop culture, and that kind of things, that especially because these kinds of things, I think, make any people more open to be manipulated by the West. For example, in Brazil, whenever there's talk about China, what people, mostly right-wing people, debate is that, and I'm going to say it literally, no, it's much better to be dominated by the United States than by China. Bro, why do we want to be dominated by whoever, but they are so dominated brainwashed by Western values, consumering patterns and aesthetics, etc., that that's instrumental for them to be more easily exploited by the West. Of course, there's the trickle-down effect where there's a little benefit, but Western values are used in this way in countries like Brazil or other Latin American countries, and I think that that's the way Western values were used in Russia also in the 90s and the beginning of the the 21st century.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you can't separate the liberal ideology from the economic system of capitalism. I mean, you know full well that in liberalism, the historical subject is the individual, but it's not just, individuals like you and I and Marcelo. It's an individual that completely has been stripped of any kind of traditional attachment to their communities that they used to have, whether it be religion or some other kind of cultural traditional forms and customs. And of course, that individual is not just much easier to manipulate, it's also the kind of individual that, I refer to this individual as an autonomous human unit, because those are the autonomous human units that are much easier to combine into random target markets and say, this is your new community, and now you're going to be advertised to, and basically create this fake community on top of something that used to be authentic and not artificial. And on top of that, I think the idea of G7 that you mentioned, that is sort of linked more to the old world, would you say that it's about the fact that it's in the very nature of capitalism. Capitalism obviously functions based on capital accumulation, if we take maybe Marxist thought here to define it, and on expansion. So at some point, there's nowhere to expand. And I think this is the point that we've reached, not even now, but a few years ago. And so because there's nowhere to expand, there is this absolute crisis that we're seeing. And that's one of the sort of deeper roots behind the stagnation that we're seeing in the G7. How would you qualify it?
Yes, well, some decades ago, we could say that the expansion of capital was still possible because the frontier was still there in Africa and the Middle East and certain parts of Asia. Though what happens is that, well, first, of course, if we are talking about the Middle East, there's the Israel factor, which, as a matter of fact, represented a barrier to the expansion of traditional capital. Most people don't know, but the oil industry was no way interested in the Iraqi war, because, as a matter of fact, the oil industry wanted the opening of relationships with Saddam Hussein and also with the Iranians and other, and we even with Gaddafi, as a matter of fact. I think that's mentioned, for example, by John Mersheimer in his book about the Israeli lobby, that the oil industry, in other words, this very important and big capitalistic sector of the United States, was interested in decent, stable relations with the countries of the Middle East. But then we have the Israeli factor, the Zionist factor, that wanted war for security reasons and for expansionistic pretensions. There, the frontier was there, but there were other geopolitical situations that made it impossible for the expansion of capital in these last frontiers. Not many of these factors weren't the kind of external factors where, for example, chaos or war is imposed on these territories, but maybe simply the fact that in the development of these countries, their own elites decided that they wanted a divorce from the West, like what happened in China, for example, little by little, very little by little, but also what we have seen in Iran, and that the fact that nowadays, when we could say that in Africa, there's already a kind of established ground for the development of capitalistic relations, the African countries, as a matter of fact, decided that they prefer to establish their economic relations with mostly China, and also, of course, Russia, and even in some specific countries with Iran or other countries. In some cases with Brazil, with Venezuela, etc. So yes, they wanted to expand the frontiers of capital to devour the whole world, because that's implicit in the idea itself of globalism, and it's part of this project in the postmodern era of capitalism, but they found many of these kinds of barriers, some of them in the national elites of these countries, some because part of the Western elites are unpredictable from an economic rationalistic standpoint, like the Zionist elites, who is which isn't which doesn't actually prioritize economics above other kinds of considerations, like they have even shown recently very clearly. So yes, that's one of the major reasons of the crisis, and that's why the crisis was unpredictable. We have grown accustomed, for example, with a kind of position from these countries where they always try to accommodate the growing Western demands. I think that, for example, most people didn't predict that the special military operation would begin. Most people said, "Oh, Putin is gonna try to accommodate with this situation, etc." Because we have grown accustomed to these kinds of situations where the West pressures, and the other countries try to adapt from a rationalistic, pragmatic standpoint. And they also didn't predict, for example, no one predicted that China would want to decouple somewhat from Western interests and from the United States. Everyone thought that China was one, that they would be forever the sweatshop of the world and absolutely nothing else. So there were a lot of situations that could not be predicted, as a matter of fact. And at least they could not be predicted from the framework that the Western elites were working with. That made it basically very hard for the expansion of capital to the limits of the known world.
Thank you for that. Go ahead.
Just a second. There's one thing that you mentioned that I think is a key point for that, is that the fact that the industrial elites wanted stable relations around the globe, and that's good for industry. But for financial countries, financialized countries, you need floating markets, you need instabilities. So I think that's also a symptom of also the United States industrial decadence and financiarizing. Am I saying that right?
I think I understand what you're saying, and also it's almost like if you can't rise up, you have to bring others down, which is what we're seeing in Europe. Some countries in Europe are being brought down deliberately, right? Like Germany, as opposed to everyone going up.
What I mean basically is that Wall Street hawks gain a lot of money if markets are floating.
Yeah, no, I understand that too. In some ways, it's much easier to deal with a chaotic, weak country or a region than it is with
especially when you control the chaos.
Exactly. I think that's a good point.